Hi again. Um, we're going to continue the narrative, but before I do that, I want to go over three of the review questions. To start, are there any questions that you have about last lecture, about any of the details of the course? Remember, the crucial date is the 19th of January, when you have to submit your papers and the exam, if it's not distributed beforehand, will be distributed. So then, I want to do these three questions. So I'm picking up at 13, the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a military defeat for the communists, but a great political victory. So in answering this, you want to tell me what the Tet Offensive was, and it is essentially a response to what had the American escalation, and it was two-pronged. It was an attack by Pavin against Quezon, but more significantly, the attack by the peasantry, by the peasant-based NLF on the towns and cities. And we can say that from a military point of view, it did not succeed because it was not able to, this offensive was not able to consolidate its control over the urban areas. It was not able to break Arvin. It was not able to overthrow two or force the Americans out. None of those things happened. And so, and moreover, the communist side lost a lot of troops. However, from a political point of view, it was a real breakthrough because it destroyed the Johnson administration and its policy of escalation. Both the establishment, the elite, and the people repudiated Johnson's policies. And so I would say that from a political point of view, it was successful. And the reason why the elite, as well as the public, gave up on escalation was that the Americans, the casualty rates were very high, and this had a huge effect on public opinion. The United States realized that it was strategically overcommitted. The economy, there was a run on the dollar as a result of inflation. The anti-war movement was, and the Black Power movement, which had been stirred up, were destabilizing American society. So I would say that that's basically an answer. Are there any questions about that? So that's the first question that I'm dealing with. The next question, the anti-war movement in the United States must be seen as a failure. Well, I would say that the truth of the matter is that we could say that it was a failure in the sense that Nixon, by invoking Vietnamization, succeeded in diffusing the anti-war movement. American troops and casualties declined. But one could say that the anti-war movement did succeed in limiting the options over to that Nixon had. He had no choice but to withdraw the troops. He was constrained by the rejection of the war by the ground war by the American population. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to add to this. Um, well, you should tell me something about in this answer of whom was the anti-war movement composed. Obviously, the students are very important, but the great majority of the Democratic Party, and there were those who thought that the war was simply a mistake, and others who felt that who were in the anti-war movement, he felt no, it was no mistake. This was American imperialism. Um, the okay, and I would say that furthermore that the anti-war movement also undermined, despite the fact that the troops in the field hated the anti-war movement, nevertheless, the fact that so many millions of people were against the war affected the morale of the troops in the field, their willingness to fight or risk their lives for what was clearly a dubious war, and moreover, with Vietnamization, it was clearly the Americans were not in that war to win. That was the way the troops looked at it. So the next question, the U.S. is 16. The U.S. could not achieve its goals in Vietnam. How did Nixon's playing of the China card allow the U.S. to change its goals? Well, this question basically calls you to analyze Nixon's policy of Vietnamization on the one hand, and then his policy of détente with the communist powers on the other. Because the policy of Vietnamization was, we could say that it was a short-run success, but in the long run, the withdrawal of American ground troops ultimately doomed the Republic of Vietnam. No matter how much the Americans built up the Republic of Vietnam, it was constituted in such a way that it could not withstand the opposition of the communist side. And that really reveals itself in the course of the next few years. But on the other hand, the policy of the détente was very successful, I would say, in the longer term, because Nixon began to play the Russians off against the Chinese. He widened the split between Russia and China. It was, of course, the split had begun in the 1950s, and ultimately he got into a kind of alliance with China against the Soviet Union. And furthermore, in this way, then the Chinese accepted the idea that whatever happened in Vietnam, that the United States had its place in East Asia. And having its place in East Asia, it maintained its overall world domination. So that's the answer to that question. I think I'll do one more. Let me find it. Oh yes, outline Nixon's and Kissinger's policy of Vietnamization and détente or linkage. How did it differ from Johnson's approach? Well, this is a kind of recapitulation of what's been said earlier. Johnson's approach emerged out of the policy of containment. It sought to avoid all-out war by the escalation of the conflict in Vietnam. And it failed, obviously. Whereas Nixon's policy was de-escalation or Vietnamization. the withdrawal of American troops while building up the Republic of Vietnam. And the other component was détente, playing off the Soviet Union against China, and ultimately maintaining Americans' presence in East Asia and its overall global hegemony. Are there any questions about all of this? Okay, let's get into the narrative. Now, we're in 1969. Nixon has taken power in January 69, and he's frustrated. The policy of the discussions in Paris with the Democratic Republic are going nowhere. The Russians are not cooperating. They're enjoying the American situation. On the ground, yes, the Americans have kind of regained the initiatives. The communists are lying low, but essentially the stalemate seems to continue. And so in this light, then Nixon is looking for leverage. He's looking for some way to somehow gain something on the battlefield. And he decides he's already begun to, he bombs Cambodia starting in the spring of 1969. But then in the spring of 1970, he decides that that's not enough, that in order to root out the communists in Cambodia, he has to get rid of the ruler of Cambodia, who is this Prince Sihanouk. Prince Sihanouk, this man has been on the throne of Cambodia since the 1940s. And so he, in sort of intriguing, the Americans intrigue with the right wing in Cambodia, particularly the military, who are deeply dissatisfied with Sihanouk. And so one of them, the most influential, a man by the General Lon Nol, stages a coup d'etat, and Sihanouk is removed, and Lon Nol, who is essentially, the Americans were complicit in this coup, and he's now dependent on the United States, and this is the way somehow they're going to get rid of the communist bases in Cambodia and also close the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So this leads me to a discussion of Cambodia. Now, why is that? Why am I turning to Cambodia? Well, because in the first place, what we're going to see now is that the war, from the removal of Sihanouk onwards, basically grows wider, in contradiction to Nixon's notion of Vietnamization. He becomes deeply enmeshed, not only in Vietnam, but also in Cambodia. The war is widened, and the American public, who believed that Nixon was getting out of the war, sees that, in fact, he's involving himself more deeply. That's one reason for considering Cambodia. A new front opens in the war, Cambodia. And the second reason is the consequences of all this. The combination of the American bombing of Cambodia and the removal of Prince Sihanouk um, leads to a destabilization of Cambodian society, um, such that, first of all, the bombing kills off about 200,000 people, but then a radical wing of the Cambodian Communist Party, led by a guy by the name of Pol Pot, assumes power. And this group is ultimately able to seize power in Cambodia, and a catastrophe occurs because this group, in pursuit of its radical aims, essentially kills off roughly 1 million, and maybe that's too low. The highest estimate is 1.8 million Cambodians die at the hands of these radical communists. So Cambodia suffers a double calamity. The American bombing and the seizure of power by these radical communists lead to about 3 million deaths in Cambodia. It's a huge tragedy. Deaths in Vietnam probably at the outside were about 4 million. So you can see that this is and of course the population is much lower, but it was a catastrophe and it needs to be discussed. That's what, those are the reasons why we're considering this. Now, so I'm going to go, today's lecture is going to be largely devoted to the situation in Cambodia, how this whole thing developed in Cambodia. Now, until he was overthrown, Sihanouk had pursued a policy of neutrality. Sihanouk pursued a policy of neutrality. He, in particular, rejected American attempts to control Cambodia. He affected a neutral position. And indeed, in 1965, that's 5 years before he's overthrown, he actually, reacting to what he said was direct attempts on the part of the Americans to actually overthrow him already in 1965, that's 5 years before the actual coup, he broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. And part of the reasons for this was his thinking about the situation. He believed that the United States was going to lose the war, that in the long term, that the communists would take over South Vietnam, just as they had North Vietnam. They would take over South Vietnam. So from his point of view, this was a neutrality, but his calculation was, I must maintain good relations with the communist side in Vietnam, with Hanoi and with the National Liberation Front. So for those reasons, he allowed the construction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He turned the other way when the communists of Vietnam set up retreats or bases in eastern Cambodia. And furthermore, he even allowed the communist side in South Vietnam to resupply themselves through the main port of Cambodia. It was really the only port on the west coast of Cambodia. In the southernmost part of it, there's a port known as, named after him, Sihanoukville. And the supplies of the National Liberation Front, the supplies from Russian ships, were landed there, and they were transported across Cambodia to the National Liberation Front sanctuaries in eastern Cambodia. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the sanctuaries, Sihanoukville, you can see that it's a one-sided neutrality that is being maintained, much to the irritation of the United States. Now, while this was Sihanouk's policy, the other side, that is to say Hanoi, the DRV, and the National Liberation Front, they they reciprocated because Sihanouk was an autocrat. He was an autocrat. It was essentially one-man rule in Cambodia. And as part of this autocracy, he suppressed the communists in Cambodia. So Sihanouk pursued a double-faced policy towards the struggle of the communists in Vietnam. He did things in favor of that, but at home, he suppressed his homegrown communists, and the communists in Vietnam said, "Well, that's his business," and they did not complain. Now, this was important because it ultimately led to an important split between the Vietnamese and Cambodian communists. The Cambodian communists said, "Well, what the hell?" The Hanoi and the National Liberation Front, they're not supporting us. They're not showing solidarity. And so it encouraged them to basically towards a policy of going it alone. And they were very bitter toward the Vietnamese. And this was going to lead actually to war, as you'll see later on. In any case, when the Americans began to bomb eastern Cambodia in the spring of 1969, Sihanouk said nothing. He pretended it wasn't happening. Meanwhile, after about a year of this, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, Nixon decided to move against the sanctuaries in the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. And in order to do that, needed to get rid of Sihanouk. So they gave the signal to Lon Nol, this right-wing general who overthrew Sihanouk. And indeed, the Americans went further because there were Cambodian troops, mercenary troops, about 8,000 of them, who were fighting the communists in South Vietnam. Lon Nol had sent these 8,000 Cambodian soldiers to fight the communists in South Vietnam. And the Americans, no sooner was the coup announced, that the Americans, using their air transport, immediately transported these 8,000 troops to the Cambodian capital in order to help I'm spelling it. In order to help Lon Nol consolidate his power. So the Americans were up to this, up to their ears in this situation. Now I want to go back and sort of look at the more deeply at Cambodia. What was happening in Cambodian society? What was happening which eventually allowed the communists to take over Cambodia? What were the underlying factors that were operating? Cambodia, of course, like Laos and Vietnam, was part of Indochina, French Indochina, which we talked about at the beginning of this course. The French had, when they set up their colonial administration, they included all three in the Indochina Confederation. Cambodia was basically part of this setup. Now, Cambodia itself was a very old state, going back to the Middle Ages. And certainly in the early modern period, it was the strongest state in the region. Vietnam was nothing. Thailand was nothing. Laos was nothing. Cambodia was a great kingdom in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, dominating the whole of Indochina. But gradually it got weaker and weaker, and the Kingdom of Vietnam and the Kingdom of Thailand got stronger, and both of them began to swallow up Cambodian territory. So when the French came in the last half of the 19th century, in a way, it helped Cambodia. It helped to stabilize their borders against their neighbors who were basically devouring them. And then the French set up their colonial administration, and it was very much very similar to the administration in Vietnam. That is to say, there was a French bureaucracy, the French police, the French Foreign Legion, the Governor General was the executive. It was the same setup. And Cambodia itself had a king. In this case, since the 40s, it had been Sihanouk, but this goes back centuries. And below the king, as in Vietnam, there was the so-called the Mandarin class were the sort of ruling elite who administered the state, and they came from the landlords, and that was the setup. So there was the traditional monarchy, there were the mandarins, but also there were a large number of Buddhists. And I would say that the Buddhists played an important role. Cambodia is a very strongly Buddhist country, like Vietnam, maybe even more strongly Buddhist, especially because Cambodia was not a particularly rich country. The monks were very close to the people. They helped the people. And so there was this, the Cambodians were way more religious than the Vietnamese. Well, in 1941, the young Sihanouk inherited the throne. He was put on the throne by the French. The French allowed this. And of course, at that time, in 1941, the French themselves were subordinate to the Japanese, who had taken over Indochina. And essentially, Sihanouk was a bit of a playboy. He didn't take politics seriously. He was interested in movies and making movies and so on, and was regarded as a kind of a puppet of both the French and the Japanese. Then in 1942, there was the first attempt to overthrow the rule of the French and the Japanese. The Viet Minh were fighting the Japanese and the French already in Vietnam, at the beginnings of the guerrilla movement of the Viet Minh. And in Cambodia, there was a revolt in 1942, which was quickly suppressed. And then after the Japanese surrendered, a free Cambodian movement, or Khmer Issarak movement, that's the Khmer language, Khmer Issarak, Free Cambodia movement developed against the French in Cambodia. Now this movement was in a way partly a spillover from the Viet Minh. There was a close connection, but there were also, as part of this movement, some elements were completely independent of the Viet Minh. They didn't have the same politics at all. They were just nationalists. But nevertheless, it's important to note that this began to happen. And then finally, Sihanouk became a full adult, and given the fact that there was this ongoing resistance against the French, in 1953, he demanded full independence from France. He, of course, said he would continue to have some relationship with them. And the French, because they were, of course, fighting, getting ready to fight the climactic battle of the war, Dien Bien Phu, they basically granted Sihanouk and Cambodia its independence, which when the Geneva Conference met in 1954, this was confirmed. And moreover, the Geneva Conference stipulated that Cambodia, like Laos, would be a neutral country. Cambodia is neutral. And of course, that's Sihanouk's policy. He's pursuing this formal neutrality as the basis of his policy. Now, in 1955, and this shows his growing maturity, Sihanouk decided, well, real politics today is not about having my being the prince or the king over Cambodia. That's not going to work anymore. So he actually resigns from the monarchy and puts himself forward as basically running for election as president of Cambodia. And he establishes his own political party called Sangum. And this, he calls elections in 1955 based on this political party, and he wins an overwhelming victory. The people love Sihanouk. The people are traditional peasants, little or no education, and so on, and they revere their ex-king and so on. So, in effect, Sihanouk, using these methods, consolidates complete control politically, and basically he doesn't allow serious opposition to him. There was in the immediate post-war a so-called Democratic Party basing itself on liberal and democratic ideas, had a certain presence in Phnom Penh, the capital, but Sihanouk basically completely marginalized them. And there was finally a third party, which called itself Prachachan. And this party was it was a front party for the communists in Cambodia. The communists set up a front political party. Well, in this election that I've just told you about, where Sihanouk won 83% of the vote, the Prachachan got 3.5% of the vote. So you can see where public opinion, largely based on the peasants who are 95% of the population, they went with Sihanouk, loyal to they can still consider him to be the king. He did some good things. He set up schools in the rural areas and health clinics and so on. And to foreign observers, they said that Cambodia, especially given the disturbances in Vietnam, that Cambodia was a kind of a paradise. It was peaceful. They had a benevolent ruler. And it seemed in all appearances that the peasants had a good life. Now, why was that? Well, because the Mekong River, which I introduced to you at the beginning of the term, ran right through Cambodia, and every spring it flooded its banks from the winter meltdown and the spring rains, and a large part of the country was covered with water, and this water irrigated the fields, made them perfect for raising rice in large amounts, and also the water was the medium in which millions and millions of fish thrived. So the Cambodian diet consisted largely of fish and rice, and the millions of Cambodian simple peasants. This was, of course, a healthy diet, a good and healthy diet. So to foreign observers, things look good in Cambodia. However, this was deceptive because after 1945, the population, partly as a result of the good conditions in Cambodia, including health and education, began to rapidly grow. From 1945, there were 2.5 million people in Cambodia. By 1970, there were 7.2 million, almost 4 times as many people. between 3 and 4 times as many people in Cambodia between 1945 and 1970. It's amazing. Now, another thing that people noted with the interest was, whereas in Vietnam there were these nasty landlords, as I explained, there were no landlords in Cambodia, which was another positive feature. However, despite the absence of landlords, the level of social inequality and economic difficulty began to seriously deteriorate in the country. Because of the rapid growth of population, the land kept being divided up. And by the late 1950s, the majority, 55% of the peasants, didn't have enough land to basically raise a family. They couldn't support their family on the land, the small plots of land that they had. And many of the peasants actually had become tenants or landless laborers. They just worked for other peasants or richer peasants. And meanwhile, the rich peasants got richer in this situation. So the poor got poorer and the rich got richer in this situation. And added to this increasingly miserable situation was the fact that as a result of the deterioration of their circumstances, many of the peasants had to loan money from usurers. And who were the usurers? Well, in the countryside, also in Phnom Penh, there were about 500,000 overseas Chinese. And these people lived either in the cities, or if they lived in the countryside, they were millers or grain brokers. And these were the people who loaned the money to the Cambodian peasants. So there was 75–80% of the peasantry were heavily in debt. So I've spent some time doing this because I'm trying to explain, I'm setting it up to sort of explain why the communists took over, and even why there was a massacre in Cambodia in the course of the war years, when the war spread from Vietnam into Cambodia. There wasn't enough land. There was all this debt. The land, because there were small plots, wasn't particularly productive. There were even food shortages. Meanwhile, in the towns were dominated, of course, by the French, had been dominated by the French. Some French remained after independence. The Chinese were very strong. They were the merchants in Phnom Penh, just as they were in Saigon. And they dominated the grain trade. They controlled the debt. They were denounced as usurers. And then there were also a certain number of Vietnamese in Cambodia and in Phnom Penh. These people had migrated from Vietnam because there was opportunity. They could become merchants. They were craftsmen. And some Vietnamese workers migrated into Cambodia because the Michelin rubber company set up huge rubber plantations, and the Vietnamese worked on these rubber plantations. So the peasants were getting poorer, but the people who lived in the cities, particularly the upper classes, were getting rich, particularly because of the control of the grain trade, usury, and so on. And how did this elite, mainly Chinese, some French, a few Vietnamese, how did they gathered the wealth from the countryside that was coming in from the countryside? how did they use this money that they had? Well, they imported luxury goods or sort of manufactured commodities like refrigerators and air conditioners and TVs and such like. So that by the mid-60s, not only was the peasant situation getting bad, but there was a serious balance of payments problem in Cambodia. And Sihanouk, seeing this, decided that he would take over foreign trade and limit the import of these luxury commodities. Well, the urban population turned against Sihanouk. They regarded him as a tyrant for doing this. So while the peasants at this point continued to support Sihanouk, the urban population from 65, the support of Sihanouk from the urban population, it rapidly declined. Now, what about the communists? I want to look a little bit now at what was happening with the communists. Well, as you remember, in 1930, Ho Chi Minh created the Indochina Communist Party, including Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And in Cambodia, this Indochina Party was dominated by the Chinese and the Vietnamese. The Cambodians were, I have to say, in the great majority, backward and uneducated peasants, and were not interested in politics. They were loyal to the king. And so there were a few Cambodians in this party, but not many. It was mainly Chinese and Vietnamese. Well, the next step, this is 1930. In 1951, the Indochina Communist Party was dissolved. There were three now independent communist parties. And in Cambodia, that took the form of the Khmer People's Party, the Communist Party of Cambodia, and now its own entity. However, in this party, the Vietnamese continued to dominate. There were more Cambodians, but not that many more. And the Vietnamese who were in this party, controlled this so-called Cambodian People's Party, basically followed the line of the Viet Minh. Just followed the line of the Viet Minh and identified with the struggle of the Viet Minh for independence. But already, we do have some written evidence of this. Some Cambodians began to complain. Some of the Cambodian communists began to say, this is not right. This party, which is supposed to be a Cambodian party, is dominated by the Vietnamese. So this sentiment was this nationalism was going to grow in the next few years. Meanwhile, the communists were struggling. Remember, they set up this Prachachan party as a front, and they ran in these elections, and they got nowhere, 3.5% of the vote. So the people as a whole looked to Sihanouk, especially the rural people. Now, Sihanouk, as I said, was an autocrat, and he wouldn't allow a democratic opposition, let alone a communist opposition. And in the wake of those elections, he suppressed the Prachachan party. Some Cambodian communists actually fled to Hanoi to escape the persecution. And others in the face actually fled Phnom Penh and fled into the countryside, where they began the difficult work under very harsh conditions of trying to turn the peasants against Sihanouk. Well, at this point, that was not possible. And so it was very difficult. Now, the party so the Prachachan is dissolved. Some of the leadership has fled to Hanoi, which leaves a remnant who is struggling to survive in the countryside, led by a man by the name of Salasar, who took the alias Pol Pot. Now, there were others involved as well in the leadership, but I'm not going to mention the name because it's not that important. But by 1962, Pol Pot's faction had come to dominate the Cambodian Communist Party. They were in the ascendant. Now, Pol Pot and his friends, there were others, there's a man by the name of Sun Sen, Yang Sari, and so on. These people were intellectuals. The leadership of this party, they were Cambodian intellectuals. Their background was middle class, indeed upper middle class. These people were essentially quite well off. They were amongst the few Cambodians who actually were prosperous. And Pol Pot and the other young intellectuals were educated in French schools, and they went to Paris to study. And in Paris, they became radicalized. They joined the French Communist Party. They associated with other third world radicals in Paris. And one of them actually wrote a PhD thesis. His name was Ho Wan. And this PhD thesis proved to be very important. He wrote it for the Sorbonne. And it was a very good thesis because a lot of the analysis that I gave you of the situation in Cambodia comes from this thesis. And it's absolutely the foundational work in terms of the social historical understanding of Cambodian society. Well, basically, what Ho Wan said in this thesis was the Phnom Penh, the people who dominate Phnom Penh, are basically controlling the peasants and they are also exploiting the peasants in the countryside. And his recommendation was that the only way Cambodia could successfully develop was to base development on the improvement of the standard of living of the peasants in the countryside, and to reduce the power of the Phnom Penh and the parasitic elites that dominated Phnom Penh. And there was a kind of this was an analysis, but the peasants hated the people from the city. There was this urban-rural split in the society. So when you combine the reality of this split with this Marxist analysis, and you combine that with the war situation, you're setting the stage up for a very dramatic event. And the dramatic event was basically that the peasants, under the leadership of this radical faction, attacked the citizens of Phnom Penh and essentially wiped them out, they killed off as many as 1.8 million people, largely from the city, but also the rich peasants were also destroyed by the Khmer Rouge. Well, we'll see how this dramatic situation developed in the next class.